At 8 a.m. on August 29th, Katrina unleashed the most powerful destructive force in written history on the Gulf Coast. New Orleans was smashed to pieces by a 20-foot bulldozer of water. Thousands of lives ended. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. After watching the horrible images of people baking on rooftops for 4 days, I asked myself, why don't these people have water yet? Now I've got a little bit of medical training. I saw a lot of people hurt down there. I saw a medical system stretched to the breaking point. I knew I could do some good. So I started doing some research, made some phone calls, and got a hold of a field hospital down in Baton Rouge. The woman I talked to on the phone said, come as soon as you can and bring IV bags, blood pressure cuffs, thermometer covers, and everything else. So I decided to act. I went around and asked for and received about 120 pounds worth of medical supplies from various medical facilities around the Lower Mainland. I made a plea to the film industry to support my cause, and enough of them answered. They filled the holes in my medical kit and bought me the survival gear I needed. So when everything was all packed up, I went down there ready to eat, sleep, and scrub dirty wounds in that hellish nightmare that I saw on CNN. I put an ad on Craigslist.com, and it was answered by the Church of Scientology. And although I'm not a Scientologist, they quickly agreed to buy me a return flight from Seattle to Baton Rouge. No red tape. It was booked 20 minutes after I agreed. On September 9th, I left for Baton Rouge with 7 days worth of ready-to-eat meals and $170 to my name. When I landed on the ground, I was picked up at the Baton Rouge airport by one of the Scientologists. They took me out to their church, made a half-hearted attempt to show me their ways. And although I was very respectful of the massive relief effort that they were putting on, the feeling in my belly was telling me that I was supposed to be somewhere else. So I thanked them very much, and I bummed a ride out to the Louisiana State University's Carl Maddox Field House, a track and field arena that they'd turned into a hospital. I walked up to the military police officer standing at the door with an M16. I told him I was a medical volunteer. And he pointed over to a desk. The volunteer at the desk was signing up doctors and nurses. She asked what my credentials were, and I told her I was a remote location first aid attendant. She looked kind of confused and shrugged. She said, is that kind of like an EMT? I was like, kind of, I guess. She shrugged, handed me a blue paper wristband that said Bud Light on it. The non-medical volunteers had red wristbands, the Budweiser wristbands. She'd pronounced me medical staff. So I walked into the shelter. One of the first things I saw was hundreds of just empty cots. Now I knew at LSU's height, they'd run through about 30,000 patients. And I found out later that FEMA had decided to close the shelter down 3 days before I had arrived. And all these people had been transferred to parts unknown. So I kind of wandered around for a little while, looking for things to do, looking at ways to help. But there was dozens of doctors and nurses sitting around waiting to be reassigned. And I knew I had to go find someplace else if I was going to be any help. So I went outside and had a cigarette. time to think up a new plan. As fate would have it, Mr. Ned Stubbs was also out there, having a cigarette. I asked him for a light. His hands were very shaky. He had trouble speaking. It didn't take me long to figure out that Ned had muscular sclerosis. I asked Ned, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Then I took the time to actually listen to him. Ned told me, "Yeah, you can help me find my daughter so I can get the hell out of here." So I thought, why not? I grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and I sat down with Ned and wrote everything he remembered about where his little girl might be. And Ned told me that just before Katrina started churning in the Gulf, his little girl had taken a job in Atlanta as a college-level English teacher. Now, Ned had his daughter's address on his home fridge at home, but that fridge was under 10 feet of water. Nasty, black, ugly water. So he didn't have a lot to go on. So I took the information that I had and I walked up to a desk that had a handwritten sign on it that said "Missing Persons." There was a young volunteer sitting behind the desk. I remember she was talking on the phone, writing on a little sticky pad. While I was standing there, she wrote 2 names, 1 phone number. While she was listening to the caller on the other line, she doodled the word "missing" next to the first name. She hung up the phone, tore the post-it note off, turfed it into this box, just simply marked "missing," like they'd forgot these people were human. I looked into the box, and it took me a while to really comprehend what I was seeing. There's this amazing, intricate landscape built of yellow sticky notes, sticky to other little bits of paper. And then clarity struck me like a fist. There was over 100 people in that box, missing their moms, their wives, their children, first separated by the storm, and then separated by the military, by the rescuers, women and children first. So I just about handed this information to this volunteer, but I thought, you know, that's going to end up in with the sticky notes. That isn't going to do Ned any good. So I went into the command center. It seemed like such a comfortable word, the command center. Someone would be in command, someone would be doing something about these missing people. Well, the command center was actually the coach's office. There was nobody in there, but there was a computer. Within 10 minutes, I had Jane Beverly Stubbs on the phone. Ned had been in that shelter for 8 days, all because nobody listened to him. Jane had been looking for her dad for 9 days. She'd pretty much given up hope. See, Ned lived in a place called Kenner, and Kenner had been flattened by the storm surge. A lot of people died there. Beverly figured her dad was one of them. She cried, and I cried. But I felt more alive than I'd ever felt before. And I suppose I got addicted to that feeling. I needed more. So I took a little walk over to the missing person's desk. Asked the nice young volunteer there to kindly go fold some towels. That day I took dozens of missing person reports. People crying, people afraid, people that lost everything. Now they didn't know if their mom was alive or dead. I soon began to realize the enormity of the crisis. It spanned the whole continental USA. Hundreds of thousands of families were divided by the policy of rescuing women and children first. Fathers and sons were left to bake on the rooftops, while the women and children, and very old, were sent to shelters, the shelters we all saw on TV. And when these terrible places filled the capacity and way beyond, they started to ship these people all over the US. They sent them by bus, by train, by plane, and not once did anyone ever come up with a way to keep track of them all. And even now, 5 weeks after the storm, these people are still anonymously stuffed in sporting arenas, churches, travel trailers, all over the continental US. They're still missing. That night I went back into the command center and I met Adam and David. They'd been spending their night searching for missing people. They taught me what they'd already learned. And we formed a group that night. More people joined our group. And we started taking calls from police sergeants looking for their whole families, embassies looking for foreign nationals, and a senator looking for friends. We gathered between 750 and 1,000 missing person cases. And in about 2 weeks, we'd reunited 200 families. The National Find Family Center had heard about us and asked us if we'd like to share resources and techniques. So we moved our files and our personnel over to a high security building surrounded by Navy SEALs. Sharing that office was FEMA, Homeland Security, DHH, and the disaster mortuary team. They gave us access to the mortuary team's database. A lot of the people we'd been looking for never even made it past the first few hours of the storm. Others had died waiting for help. But the worst were the human lives ended by savage violence. There they were, cold and naked on my computer screen, identified by DNA or tattoos or dental records. But the families hadn't been informed yet. All we could do was to make sure that DMORT had the contact information we collected, say a few words for the dead, walk the file over to the shredder. That's all we could do. The problems were enormous. The emotional stress was tearing our morale to pieces. So we went out, ate a bunch of Cajun food, got blindly drunk. The next day, Rita entered the Gulf. Packing winds of 175 miles an hour. They expected a big chunk of the Texas coastline to be destroyed, entire cities to be lost. they talked of a new category for hurricanes. So I postponed my flight home. And we started rebuilding the LSU Special Needs Shelter. Then the government ordered a mandatory evacuation of the area. And thousands more were displaced and evacuated. We went back to work finding the missing. But they'd all been shuffled, chipped, and we had to start from scratch. And now, physically and mentally exhausted, my resources spent, I was forced to fly home to Vancouver. Despite the exhaustion I felt, I couldn't fall into my usual deep sleep on the flight home from Baton Rouge. I was tormented by guilt. The guilt of having left all those people behind, people I'd promised to help. Now that I'm back home, I find no relief in distractions. I can't just slip back into my life I had before Katrina. The journey that I'd begun 3 weeks ago was left incomplete. And now I find myself tortured by the faces of this terrible disaster. And at the same time inspired by the people who stood tall and were heroes in the face of this catastrophe. But there's still so much to do before any of the victims of Mother Nature's wrath can even start to heal. During my 3 weeks in Louisiana, our small group of volunteers collected over 1,000 missing person reports. My group on the ground in Baton Rouge is still taking reports every day. By the time I had left, we'd reunited over 200 families, and they all had incredible stories to tell. Now, I've spent the last 12 years of my life on film sets, and I understand that I'm breaking the unwritten rules of approaching a producer with a project, but there's no time for treatments, formality. If I'd have followed all the rules, this story wouldn't be nearly interesting enough to keep your attention this long. What we've got in mind are 3 projects. The first is a reality TV series. It's based on rebuilding the lives of the middle-class families that we've found. The second is a feature-length documentary utilizing the network of hundreds of medical professionals that were the first on the ground. The story through their eyes is incredible. And the third is still a secret. So if you're watching this right now and you realize it's in the wrong hands, please feel free to put it in the right ones. If you're interested, but you're skeptical, give me 5 minutes in person. And if you look into your heart and you know that you were meant to do this project, then give me, George Young, a call at 604-505-7473. 200 families are sleeping easier tonight, but we promise to find them all.